Skylar Neese was not the type of teenager who could be overlooked. With her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, expressive eyes, and an infectious laugh, she lit up any room she entered. In Weirton, Pennsylvania, she was known as someone who cared deeply about her friends, her family, and her small community. To those who knew her, she seemed invincible, too vibrant, too careful, too smart to ever be in serious danger. But on that humid summer evening in July 2012, everything changed. Skylar had spent the day laughing with friends, scrolling through her phone, and sharing fleeting jokes about summer break. When she told her parents she was stepping out for a quick visit to a friend's house, they barely glanced up from their routines, trusting her as they always had. Nothing seemed unusual, at least on the surface. As twilight fell, the streets of Weirton glimmered under the fading sun. Birds chirped lazily, and the distant hum of traffic filled the background. Skylar's friends exchanged casual messages, confirming plans that seemed innocent enough. But underneath the surface, subtle tensions lingered. Disagreements that had been swept under the rug, whispers of jealousy that no one dared speak aloud. Skylar walked out the door, her backpack slung over her shoulder, the faint scent of summer air mingling with her perfume. She waved goodbye to her parents, smiling brightly, unaware that she would never return home that night. Hours passed. First came the slight worry. Where is she? Then came the panic as repeated calls went unanswered. Her parents' initial concern turned to frantic action. They called neighbors, friends, and eventually the police. By the time night fully descended, the neighborhood was awake with unease. The search for Skylar Neese had begun. Detective John Wilson, a veteran of the Pennsylvania State Police, received the missing person report and immediately understood the urgency. Skylar wasn't just another runaway. Something felt different. Her disappearance was sudden, her personality too grounded, her life too full of love and connection for her to vanish willingly. He dispatched teams to canvass the neighborhood, speak with classmates, and trace her phone activity. As the investigation unfolded, inconsistencies emerged. Friends gave conflicting accounts of the evening's events. One mentioned that Skylar had planned to meet someone she had known for years. Another insisted she had gone to a different friend's house entirely. Text messages were vague, and social media activity suggested normalcy, giving the illusion that she was still alive and well. Yet the growing unease among detectives hinted at a darker truth. The community rallied. Flyers were posted at every intersection, every corner store, every school bulletin board. Volunteers combed the surrounding woods, parks, and abandoned areas, hoping for even the smallest clue. Local news outlets ran segments on Skylar's disappearance, showing her smiling face and urging anyone with information to come forward. Days passed with no sign of her. Each morning brought fresh anxiety to her parents, Sherry and Rick Neese, who were forced to confront a nightmare that had no immediate answers. The media coverage intensified, painting a picture of a community gripped by fear. Every knock at the door, every phone call carried a sliver of hope, only to dash it against the unyielding reality of her absence. The police began to focus on her closest friends. Interviews revealed a web of secrets that had been simmering beneath the surface. Small disputes, fleeting moments of jealousy, and the unspoken rivalries that teenagers often dismiss as trivial now took on an ominous weight. Investigators noted that Skylar's last known movements involved interactions with these very friends. The threads of trust, once unbreakable, were now tangled in suspicion and uncertainty. As the night deepened into an oppressive darkness, Detective Wilson and his team began piecing together the timeline. Every detail mattered: the timestamp of Skylar's last text, the route she had taken, the people she had spoken to. Forensic teams scanned her room for clues, analyzing items she might have carried, objects left behind, or messages that could shed light on her intentions. Meanwhile, the community's unease became palpable. Parents kept their children closer, schools increased patrols, and teenagers whispered about the mystery that had suddenly invaded their small town. Rumors flew. Some claimed Skylar had run away, others suspected foul play. The truth, as it would soon become horrifyingly clear, was far worse than anyone could imagine. By the end of that first night, a grim realization settled over Weirton. Skylar Neese was not merely missing. The cheerful, outgoing girl who had walked out her front door hours earlier was trapped in a situation none of her loved ones could have anticipated. The seeds of betrayal had been planted long before her disappearance, and now they had begun to bear fruit in the most tragic way. Detective Wilson knew that time was critical. Teenagers, no matter how close they seemed, sometimes hid dangerous secrets. The signs, however subtle, had to be uncovered before they were lost forever. His team began analyzing Skylar's digital footprint, scouring social media interactions and text exchanges for clues. The tone of some messages, innocuous at first glance, hinted at undercurrents of tension that could no longer be ignored. By the first light of dawn, the search expanded. Helicopters hovered over wooded areas, drones scanned dense foliage, and canine units combed fields and creek beds. Every lead, no matter minor, was followed. Yet as the sun rose over Pennsylvania, it became painfully evident that this was not a simple missing person case. Something far darker had occurred, and the first piece of the puzzle, the night Skylar Neese disappeared, was only the beginning of a story that would shock a community and ultimately the nation. The chilling truth remained hidden in the shadows. Behind smiles, laughter, and friendships that seemed ordinary, a plan had been set in motion, a betrayal that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. And as the day began, the police and community braced themselves for the terrifying reality that lay ahead. The bright light of Skylar Neese's life had been extinguished, and the hunt for answers had only just begun. The first week after Skylar Neese disappeared was a blur of activity and anxiety. Police officers canvassed every street in Weirton, Pennsylvania, interviewing neighbors, classmates, and anyone who had seen her that fateful night. The town was restless. Each phone call that her parents received, each knock on their door, carried the heavy weight of hope and the crushing dread of disappointment. Detective John Wilson and his team began to focus on Skylar's inner circle, the friends she spent the most time with, the ones who knew her routines, her moods, and her secrets. Among them, two names repeatedly surfaced, Skylar's closest friends, who had been inseparable with her since middle school. On the surface, they had shared laughter, sleepovers, and inside jokes, but when the detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies emerged that no one could ignore. The questioning was methodical. Wilson asked simple questions. Where were you on the evening of July 6th? Who did you see Skylar with? Did she seem upset, anxious, or different in any way? At first, the friends answered calmly, almost rehearsed, as if the truth was too heavy to reveal. But subtle slips began to appear. Times didn't match, stories contradicted themselves, and minor details were strangely absent. Meanwhile, digital evidence painted a more complicated picture. Text messages between Skylar and her friends, once innocent and light-hearted, revealed hidden tension. Jealousy simmered beneath the surface. Arguments that seemed trivial on the outside, but in hindsight suggested that a darker plan could have been brewing. Social media interactions, too, showed subtle signs of exclusion and rivalry. Detectives noticed patterns in the behavior of the two friends that raised more alarm. One had deleted entire conversation threads from their phone. Another had posted cryptic status updates that hinted at secrecy and hidden guilt. Every small detail added to the growing suspicion. This was not a disappearance caused by accident or flight. It was the work of someone Skylar had trusted. The Neese family felt the weight of every revelation. Each interview, each snippet of evidence chipped away at the image they had of their daughter's friends as innocent companions. Fear mingled with disbelief. How could someone who laughed alongside Skylar, shared secrets and plans, and called themselves a friend possibly be responsible for her disappearance? Detective Wilson began piecing together a timeline of Skylar's last hours. He reviewed security footage from local stores, scanned GPS data from phones, and mapped out every known interaction. Slowly, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The evening that Skylar had vanished was not a simple outing, it was a carefully orchestrated plan by people she trusted. Every choice, every movement had been calculated to keep the crime hidden, at least temporarily. As the days stretched on, tension in the town grew palpable. Schools implemented stricter measures. Parents became hyper-aware of their children's activities. Conversations in classrooms, hallways, and living rooms were dominated by speculation. Every teen in Weirton felt a subtle shift. The innocence of friendship seemed fragile, even dangerous. The detectives' investigation also uncovered unsettling behavior leading up to the disappearance. Small arguments over trivial matters, bursts of anger, and the subtle exclusion of Skylar from certain social interactions hinted at motives that were at first almost incomprehensible. Jealousy, resentment, and perceived slights, things that seemed trivial in the grand scheme, had coalesced into a plan with devastating consequences. Evidence from Skylar's digital footprint suggested that she may have sensed something was wrong, even if she could not name it. She had sent messages asking to meet friends, seemingly casual, but there were undertones of unease. This realization struck the detectives deeply. Skylar had been cautious, aware, yet unaware of the true danger that lurked so close to her. Community members struggled to reconcile the cheerful girl they had known with the ominous signs that were only visible in hindsight. Friends and neighbors tried to remember interactions, conversations, and behaviors that might explain the motives behind such a heinous act. The answers were elusive, yet the tension in the air was undeniable. Everyone sensed that the nightmare they feared was slowly becoming reality. The pressure on the detectives intensified. They began coordinating with state and federal authorities, pooling resources and expertise. Forensic teams scoured the known hangouts of Skylar and her friends, analyzing phones, personal belongings, and shared spaces. Every deleted message, every erased note became a potential clue. Slowly, the meticulous planning behind Skylar's disappearance came into sharper focus. One afternoon, a breakthrough occurred. Investigators discovered subtle contradictions in statements made by one of Skylar's friends. The lies were not large at first glance, times slightly off, locations remembered vaguely, but the cumulative inconsistencies painted a stark portrait of someone hiding a devastating secret. It became clear the danger was not external and the victim was not a stranger to her perpetrators. As evidence mounted, the detectives felt both urgency and dread. Skylar's disappearance was no longer simply a mystery. It was the first thread in a tapestry of betrayal, deceit, and premeditated violence. The community's sense of safety had been irrevocably shattered, and the reality began to sink in. The perpetrators were people Skylar had trusted most. Night fell once again over Weirton, the air heavy with summer humidity and the collective anxiety of a town gripped by fear. Search parties continued to scan the surrounding forests and parks, volunteers distributed flyers, and parents prayed that their children would never face such a horror. But Detective Wilson knew the truth was closer than anyone realized, and the darkness that had been hidden behind smiles and laughter was about to be exposed. By the end of Part 2, the foundation of the crime was clear. Skylar's disappearance was not random. It was the result of deliberate actions by those she had loved and trusted. The stage was set for confessions, revelations, and a community confronting a betrayal so personal it would redefine trust forever. The tension lingered like a storm cloud over the town. Everyone was waiting, anxious and fearful of the moment when the hidden truth would finally come to light. And in the shadows of this small Pennsylvania town, the investigation pressed forward, chasing the secrets that had turned friendship into something deadly. By the second week after Skylar Neese's disappearance, the small town of Weirton, Pennsylvania, had been consumed by fear and speculation. The cheerful streets seemed quieter, almost hollow, as parents kept their children close and neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Skylar's name was everywhere, on the news, on social media, in worried conversations. But despite the relentless search, there was still no sign of her. Detective John Wilson knew one thing with certainty. The answers were not out there. They were closer than anyone imagined. The focus of the investigation had narrowed to Skylar's closest friends, the ones who had spent the most time with her in the days leading up to her disappearance. They were no longer just witnesses. They were suspects. Every day that passed increased the likelihood that the truth was waiting to be uncovered in their stories, their messages, their behaviors. Interrogations were intense, exhausting, and meticulous. Detectives questioned the friends repeatedly, often for hours at a time, pressing for inconsistencies, testing their alibis, and watching their reactions with hawk-like attention. At first, the suspects remained calm, even confident, as though they could evade the truth forever. But as the hours stretched into days, cracks began to appear. It started with hesitation, a pause too long, a shift in posture, a sudden avoidance of eye contact. Then came contradictions, timelines that didn't match, explanations that felt rehearsed but failed under scrutiny. The detectives could sense the tension building. Something was brewing, something the suspects could no longer contain. Finally, in a dimly lit interrogation room, one of the friends broke. The confession came quietly at first, almost in disbelief, as though saying the words aloud made them real. Then the voice grew steadier, colder, and the details began to flow. Every lie, every hidden action, every calculated move came pouring out like a dark torrent that had been bottled up for too long. The confession was chilling. Skylar had been lured out of her home under the guise of friendship, unaware that the night would end in betrayal. The plan had been meticulous, carefully crafted to avoid detection. The two friends had discussed it in whispers, mapped it out with frightening precision, and executed it with a cold, deliberate hand. Detectives listened, taking notes and cross-referencing every detail with what they already knew. The confession filled in gaps, the route Skylar had taken, the locations she had been led to, and the moments when the perpetrators ensured no one would see or hear. The premeditation was undeniable. This was not a moment of rage or impulsive anger. It was a calculated act, a betrayal by those she had trusted most. The motive, while shocking in its simplicity, was steeped in teenage rivalry and envy. Small disputes, perceived slights, and jealousy over friendships had escalated into something far more sinister. What seemed trivial to outsiders, arguments over who was included in plans, who had the attention of peers, had metastasized into a deadly obsession. For Detective Wilson and his team, the confession was both a breakthrough and a horror. It confirmed suspicions that had been building for weeks, but the details were almost too disturbing to process. Skylar's final hours were reconstructed piece by piece. The laughter that turned to confusion, the trust that was exploited, the moments of innocence shattered by premeditated violence. As the details emerged, the Neese family was confronted with an unimaginable reality. Skylar's parents, Sherry and Rick, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. The friends they had welcomed into their home, the ones they had trusted implicitly, had orchestrated their daughter's murder. The grief was raw, searing, and compounded by disbelief. How could someone so young, so familiar, commit such an act? The confession also revealed the chilling psychological manipulation that had taken place. Skylar had not recognized the danger because it came cloaked in friendship. The perpetrators had used her trust against her, creating an illusion of normalcy that masked the deadly reality. Every gesture of care, every promise of loyalty had been a tool in a plan designed to destroy her. By the time the confession concluded, the magnitude of the crime was fully clear. Skylar Neese had been the victim of a betrayal so intimate, so calculated, that it reverberated through the entire community. The town that had once seen laughter, innocence, and teenage camaraderie now understood the fragility of trust and the darkness that could lurk behind familiar faces. Detective Wilson reflected on the complexity of human behavior, particularly among teenagers. Adolescence is a time of intense emotion, fragile identities, and shifting loyalties. But the murder of Skylar Neese was not the result of simple teenage impulse. It was the outcome of careful planning, manipulation, and a willingness to cross moral boundaries that most people cannot even imagine. By the end of Part 3, the community, the police, and the Neese family understood the horrifying truth. Skylar's death was not random. It was a deliberate act carried out by those who had once been closest to her. The confession had pulled back the veil on the darkness hidden in plain sight, exposing the consequences of envy, betrayal, and cold calculation. The stage was now set for the final chapter, the trial, the reckoning, and the aftermath of a crime that had shattered not just a family, but an entire community. The confession had answered many questions, but it also left lingering echoes of horror, grief, and disbelief that would take years to heal. As the town braced for justice, one fact remained painfully clear. Skylar Neese's life was stolen in the most intimate of betrayals, and her story would haunt Weirton, Pennsylvania, forever. The trial of Skylar Neese's killers became a focal point for the nation. News crews, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts descended upon Weirton, Pennsylvania, eager to witness the courtroom proceedings in a case that had captivated the public imagination. Families, neighbors, and former classmates filled the small gallery, their eyes heavy with grief, disbelief, and the need for answers. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, electric with anticipation. Prosecutors laid out the meticulously gathered evidence, text messages deleted and recovered, digital footprints traced with precision, and witness testimony painting a portrait of betrayal and premeditation. Every detail from the confessions made in the police station was presented as cold, hard fact. The audience felt the weight of each revelation, the planning, the manipulation, the cruelty of a crime executed by those closest to the victim. The defense attempted to frame the actions as impulsive teenage misjudgment. They argued that the perpetrators had been overwhelmed by emotions, that they didn't fully comprehend the consequences of their actions. But the evidence was overwhelming. Every text, every inconsistency, every piece of forensic data corroborated the confession and demonstrated an unnerving level of deliberation. The jury could see without a doubt that this was not an accident, not a moment of teenage folly, it was murder. For Skylar's parents, Sherry and Rick Neese, each day of the trial was a mix of pain, anger, and relief. Relief that the truth had come to light, but anger and grief at the magnitude of the betrayal. They listened as witnesses described the meticulous plotting, the exploitation of trust, and the cold execution of a plan that had ended their daughter's life. Every detail was a dagger, reopening wounds that had never truly healed since that summer night. Community members and classmates watched the trial with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some were stunned that teenagers, people they had seen walking, laughing, and joking in the hallways, could commit such a heinous act. Others struggled with fear, realizing that the seemingly ordinary friendships around them could hide unimaginable danger. The story of Skylar Neese became more than a tragic headline. It was a mirror reflecting the fragility of trust, the potency of jealousy, and the consequences of unchecked emotion. Outside the courtroom, the town of Weirton wrestled with its own healing. Schools held assemblies and meetings to address the impact on students, emphasizing the importance of communication, awareness, and mental health. Parents reinforced caution, teaching their children to recognize warning signs and trust their instincts. The murder, while personal to the Neese family, became a collective lesson on vigilance and the complexities of adolescent psychology. For Detective John Wilson and his team, the trial was a bittersweet conclusion. Months of tireless work, painstaking investigation, and relentless pursuit of the truth had culminated in justice being served. Yet the satisfaction was tempered by the lingering tragedy of a life stolen, the emotional trauma inflicted on the family, and the eerie reality that the crime had been carried out by those who should have cared most for Skylar. As the prosecution presented its closing arguments, the courtroom was silent with intensity. They painted a picture of friendship turned deadly, of envy morphing into obsession, and of calculated cruelty disguised as innocence. Each word struck the audience with a mixture of grief and incredulity. And then the defense offered its final plea, emphasizing youth, impulsivity, and remorse. But the jury, armed with the weight of evidence and the clarity of the confession, was resolute. Verdict day arrived with a tense hush over Weirton. Friends, family, journalists, and townspeople filled the courtroom once more. When the jury returned, their expressions were solemn but firm. The charges were upheld, convictions rendered, and justice, though unable to undo the tragedy, was formally delivered. Sherry and Rick Neese felt a measure of relief, knowing that the truth had been recognized, but the pain remained, permanent and unshakable. The aftermath of the trial rippled far beyond the courtroom. Skylar's story sparked discussions on teen violence, mental health, and the importance of parental involvement. Schools across the region introduced programs to educate students about peer pressure, jealousy, and the consequences of unchecked emotions. Parents spoke openly about monitoring friendships and communication, understanding that the line between ordinary adolescent conflict and dangerous behavior can be dangerously thin. Community members struggled to make sense of the events. The cheerful streets of Weirton seemed quieter, as though the town itself mourned the innocence lost. Conversations in homes and classrooms reflected a collective grappling with the harsh reality that betrayal could come from those closest, that appearances could be deceiving, and that life could change irrevocably in an instant. Skylar Neese's memory lived on in those who loved her. Friends who had survived the ordeal reflected on the fragility of trust and the weight of their own actions. Teachers remembered a bright student, full of promise, whose life had been tragically cut short. The town erected memorials and held vigils, celebrating her life while acknowledging the profound loss. For the Neese family, healing was a long, complicated journey. Each anniversary, each holiday carried echoes of grief and remembrance. But they channeled their pain into advocacy, raising awareness about teen crime, emphasizing the importance of community vigilance, and sharing Skylar's story as both a cautionary tale and a tribute. Skylar's story became a symbol of lost innocence, of the consequences of jealousy and betrayal, and the enduring need for justice and awareness. It was a reminder that even in small towns among familiar faces, darkness could hide in plain sight. But it was also a testament to resilience, of a family seeking answers, a community striving to understand, and a justice system determined to hold perpetrators accountable. As Weirton slowly began to heal, the memory of that summer night lingered. Skylar Neese had been more than a victim. She had been a bright, vibrant life, loved and cherished by all who knew her. The tragedy of her death left scars, but it also ignited reflection, awareness, and a commitment to preventing such horrors in the future. In the end, justice was served, but the story of Skylar Neese remained a haunting lesson. Friendship can turn deadly, trust can be betrayed, and life can change in an instant. Her story, both tragic and transformative, would never be forgotten.